Welcome to Radical Engagements here at Barnblog, and we are finishing part 3 of our discussion of Efraim Carlebach's Forgetting Mark Fisher. I would check the show notes for the prior 2 videos because I'm going to give you context for my relationship to Mark, my relationship to the Platypus Affiliated Society, which published this essay, and the rest of the essay and my commentary on it. Continuing on. Perhaps it's to combat this form of deflationary consciousness, Fisher turned to forms of consciousness raising, salvaged from the 60s, 70s New Left under the rubric of acid communism. The title of the book he was planning at the time of his suicide, whereas in 2009, capitalist realism was the pathology of the left that had developed as a consequence of the bad repetition of the 60s. With acid communism, Fisher began to focus on neoliberalism as a strategy of the right to destroy the 60s, 70s experiments in democratic socialism and consciousness raising. Quote, we must regain the optimism of that 70s moment, unquote. I've always thought that Fisher's turn was weird here. And that turn began in, as Carlebach actually notes priorly in the essay, in the piece about democracy is joy, and is really solidified in his defense of Russell Brand and Jeremy Corbyn in the Vampire Castle essay, which I published. This kind of shift in perspective has always indicated to me that part of the purpose of the Vampire Castle is actually Fisher arguing against himself. Fisher, in his critiques of identitarianism and joylessness, also attacks people who say that social democratic reforms aren't going to be good enough, that we always need to push for more, and that, mild movements towards that end were going to be insufficient, and he condemned that. Where his own work in 2009, if you read it closely, actually is totally copacetic with that reading. It is almost as if part of who is changing in the Vampire Castle essay, which is not noted here by Carlebach, but is by me, who, as I remember, one of the people who published the essay, notices that Fisher's actually walking back his prior positions and putting them in the mouth of someone else. I wonder what Matt Calhoun will say about that. Anyway, this remarkable reversal of his earlier position against the thesis of Adam Curtis's documentary Hypernormalization, BBC 2016, which Fisher once shared, that the counterculture led to neoliberalism. Fisher began to argue that, quote, the failure of the left after the 60s had much more to do with its repudiation of or refusal to engage with the dreaming that the counterculture unleashed. Asterisk. This is Varn here. Curtis himself flirts with this Fisher-like turn. Curtis in quoting Graeber, and Graeber in most of his work post-debt, even from his advocacy in Occupy to his posthumous works on Pirates and The Dawn of Everything. Graeber also seems to think that if only we believed in more joy and more egalitarianism, that we could alter the state of being. And while belief is a subjective condition that matters, and I actually do think it does, I think this insistence that it is just that is actually a reversion. It is not actually an improvement. Not that, and it allows for a kind of pallid social democracy, which is totally copacetic with progressivism, to become the dominant mode of the left. It is interesting that the name acid communism came to Fisher when he heard actor David Tennant, I did not know this, describe the new left psychologist R.D. Laing as an acid Marxist. Fisher changed this acid to acid communism, completing his affinity to Badiou's communist hypothesis. Asterisk. I would need Carlebach to prove that in Fisher's writing for me to believe that it's actually Badiou who he's calling back to here. I think that accusation is a little bit underfounded, even though I know how and why Carlebach is justifying it. In the crisis of neoliberalism, it seems that the left will never recover Marxism's negativity, but the supposed positivity of, quote, communism. presumably the acid in there so that we realize that everything is, quote, mere contingency. Inspired by acid communism, some labor activists have coined the term acid corporatism. This was in 2019. In the crisis of neoliberalism, this return to the new left goes hand in hand with a return to the old left, a return to laborism and social democracy, as well as to nostalgia for the communist parties. And in 2019, Carlebach's right, this was rampant. And we see that degeneration as Bernie fades away, that a nostalgia for actually assisting socialism, but cleaned up, is very much in vogue. Now, this is in response to the kind of nascent anti-communism rampant on the left from the 50s forward, but it's also kind of a denial of historical reality. Something that, even if you're a Marxist-Leninist, much less than the other kind of leftist, you do have to wrestle with. Back to Carlebach's text. In the crisis of neoliberalism, the left is trying to belatedly put the 20th century back together again, as if the political disputes on the left never happened. I notice this all the time. Carlebach's right. There's so much. Carlebach's right. There's so much that we're just trying to put back in the box. Sino-Soviet split, back in the box. Failure of the Popular Front, back in the box. National liberation stalling out in developmentalism, back in the box. Revolution's not happening in the developed world, not only back in the box, but let's revive obscure 60s theories from China that have been long abandoned even in China and not acknowledge what they were originally about. Three worlds theories, by the way, put the United States and Russia in the first world, just to remind you. Fisher sought to return to the cultural revolution of the new left, but without the destruction of the welfare state, wishing for the Blair that never was. Fisher wanted the old and new. And as he wrote in 2014, we don't have to choose between anti-class politics and anti-authoritarianism any more than we have to choose between Gramsci, Deleuze, and Guattari. Asterisk, this is Warren talking. You have to choose between Gramsci and Deleuze and Guattari. They're actually not the same frameworks. Those are not even the only frameworks on the table, but you do have to choose between them. And to me, Fisher's kind of incoherence around whether or not he was a Marxist, whether or not he thought Marxist class categories made sense, all this is related to this refusal to choose. It's an everything in the kitchen sink approach to leftism. This sentiment was also expressed in the editorial to the recently revived Tribune magazine, a relic of the labor left, which this January featured Mark Fisher. The editorial to the first issue, titled The Old and the New, affirmingly quoted Michael Foot. Quote, "The old dogmas are as good as ever. But putting the old and the new left back together again in this way is not an act of remembering, but an act of forgetting. Forgetting that the old labor left, which the Stalinist Communist Party supported, was never about overcoming capitalism, but as Fisher puts it, mitigating its worst excesses." That's a big, I don't necessarily disagree in all cases, particularly in the 1950s and the Khrushchevite period. Even though I kind of like Khrushchev as far as Soviet leaders go, I find this is going to need a lot more argumentation than just an assertion. Efraim, sorry. Forgetting that the new left ever broke with the old left and opposed the welfare state. It did until it didn't, right? Because the new left eventually defended the welfare state as neoliberalism came around. You can totally see this. This is just foreign editorializing here. But the new left itself was incoherent about its relationship to the welfare state. Forgetting the critique of the new left's abandonment of politics for the gesture of oppositional culture. Forgetting what is sore about the past because it has never been overcome. Gotta agree with you, Efraim. Fisher was as well aware of this type of forgetting. In Capitalist Realism, he describes how forgetting becomes an adaptive strategy by editing out the point of suture. We accept the incommensurable. The left participates in forgetting to convince itself that there is a new wave and we can now start to ride it towards post-capitalism. The collapsing of the millennial left into the Labor Party has coincided with the previously incommensurable by adding the old and the new together and lowering their horizons. Compelled by the fear of the new, which is inevitably coming from the right. But Fisher put it a decade ago. Resistance to the new is not the cause that the left can or should rally around. To read Mark Fisher against the grain would mean to re-expose the sutures of the left, to expose what is still sore. And I would add to Ephraim's commentary to point out that Fisher backed away from his own original imperative. I miss Mark. And this critique is in some ways a tribute to him, and it's not mine. But when I read this essay again recently, and I am probably going to interview Efraim, it might be out before I release all these, I'm not sure. It won't be for my channel, it will be for another one. I'm part of a committee on this interview. And once it is released, I will put it in the show notes. But nonetheless, it is the case that you can read Mark Fisher against Mark Fisher, just like you can read elements of Marx against Marx. And you should. It is clarifying to you where the capitulation to reality actually ends up being. Capitulation to reality in the bad sense of the term. And what the theoretical problems were. Mark Fisher was neither not a Marxist, nor was he a Marxist enough to be consistent in his categories. And I don't say this to condemn him, but I say it as a kind of way to deal with the fact that his categories weren't always Marxist, and sometimes they were. I have read tons of Fisher now, even more than when I first published that Vampire Castle essay a decade ago. And ultimately, while there are elements of Efraim Carlebach's critique that I would want spelled out more, in the main, I have to agree with most of it. I hope you like this new series. We're going to try to keep these within the 20-30 minute range most of the time. Every now and then it'll require me to do an hour, but super long radical engagements don't seem to work very well. I'm going to release these close together, so by the time you've seen this, you've probably seen all of them pretty quickly. And like and subscribe. I do more of these on the back end of the channel. And I think while I'm still going to do selections of books, just so I can be complete and also spread essays that I think are worthwhile, I'm going to be doing these engagements on essays as well because I can complete them. All right. And with that, keep engaging with the literature.